Welcome! I have talked about several campaigns in World War II, but so far I've failed to mention the Winter War, which was a brief conflict between Finland and the Soviet Union. I'm remedying that mistake in this video, explaining the situation, how the war progressed, and its ultimate conclusion. Even though Finland broke away from Soviet Russia in 1917 and signed a treaty with the Bolshevik leadership a few months later, the two countries were not on very good terms. Finland emphasized its neutral stance and focused on cooperation with Sweden and Estonia, while the Soviet Union supported Finnish communists who even tried to assassinate Marshal Mannerheim in 1920. A non-aggression pact was signed in 1932, the Finnish economy slowly recovered, and by the late 30s, radical political movements lost their edge. Stalin's Great Purge in 1938, in which most Finnish communists were also killed, ruined the country's reputation, but he also took a more aggressive stance and demanded territory from Finland in order to secure the Leningrad area, an offer that the Finns refused. Negotiations continued, while the secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided Eastern Europe into two spheres of influence. Finland happened to be in the Soviet sphere, and when the Baltic countries were forced to accept Soviet troops in their territory in September and October 1939, Finland's situation worsened. Stalin already expected a German attack and wanted some Finnish islands along with the area around Leningrad. Both sides mobilized, and plans were made for a Soviet attack that would start in November, as Stalin's hands were not tied anymore. He knew that Germany would not protest, while the country's expulsion from the League of Nations would be meaningless. In early November, the Soviets offered territory in East Karelia in return for the Karelian Isthmus and the islands in the Gulf of Finland. It was eventually rejected. A counter-offer was made, which would have been a compromise, doubling the distance between Leningrad and the border, but the Finnish delegation returned home in mid-November, expecting that the next round would start soon. Instead, an incident took place on the 26th of November, in which a Soviet village near the border was shelled, resulting in a few deaths and injuries. It was in fact a false flag operation carried out by an NKVD unit. Finland denied responsibility, just as the Soviets wanted. It is not clear whether the goal was the seizure of territory or the conquest of Finland, but the former is more likely. In any case, war came next. Soviet plans called for a quick invasion that would last a few weeks. Not everybody was as optimistic, though. Chief of Staff Shaposhnikov wanted more reserves and fire support, while commander of the Leningrad Military District, General Merezkov, underestimated Finnish strength, even though he had also raised concerns regarding the terrain and the climate. Overall, 4 armies with 21 divisions, a tank corps and 3 tank brigades were to attack, taking all the desired territory and maybe even cutting Finland into 2 halves. The Finns could muster 8 divisions and various smaller units, but they relied heavily on the geography and the lack of paved roads. Their defensive positions were well built, but their efforts were hindered by ammunition and gun shortages, which foreign shipments could not completely alleviate. On the last day of November, the invasion commenced with 450,000 men and the bombing of Helsinki. Marshal Mannerheim was appointed commander-in-chief of the Finnish forces, while the League expelled the Soviet Union, as expected. In the following days, a puppet government was formed in the parts of Karelia controlled by the Soviets, but this did not divide the Finns, who supported their own government. Achieving military success was much more difficult. The deep defenses that were now called the Mannerheim Line held against initial attacks, partly because of inferior Soviet tactics that employed frontal attacks with armor but no infantry support. In close-range combat, Soviet tanks could be dealt with by using logs, Molotov cocktails, and other tools, so losses quickly mounted. South of Lake Ladoga, Soviet 7th Army could not advance even after tanks were brought in to support the infantry. North of the lake, 8th Army built a new railroad but lost to a much smaller Finnish force, while in central and northern Finland, the large Soviet formations, dressed in standard khaki uniforms and no winter boots, were fighting the harsh climate, in contrast to the smaller Finnish units that used ski troopers and proper warm clothing. Their guerrilla tactics proved superior, relying on speed and maneuver. Many Soviet units were encircled, but the Finns were too weak to fully destroy these units. In late December, fighting continued on the Mannerheim Line, which was a series of strongpoints with concrete bunkers and trenches. In the First Battle of Summa, Soviet tanks broke through but received no support from the infantry, so they were eventually destroyed. Some units refused to participate in more frontal attacks, but they resisted when a Finnish counterattack attempted to encircle them, so neither side could achieve victory. North of Lake Ladoga, larger Soviet troops advanced, but they were often outflanked by the Finns, who attacked large columns and encircled several units. However, these units did not surrender. They entrenched, fought bravely, and waited for reinforcements. One division was destroyed as it marched into Finland. Its equipment and ammunition helped the Finns greatly. However, up north, the ice-free port of Petsamo was given up after a Soviet division attacked it. In the air, the Soviet Air Force was not very effective. Their 2,500 planes lacked proper targets in Finland. Their opponent only had 114, mostly outdated fighters, but they soon received more modern aircraft from France, Britain, the USA, Sweden, and Italy. They managed to shoot down 200 Soviet planes, but twice as many were lost due to weather and lack of fuel and tools. In late December, Shaposhnikov gained full authority over Soviet forces. He stopped all frontal attacks, while Marshal Voroshilov was replaced by Timoshenko on the 7th of January as commander of all participating units. The Red Army was reorganized and reinforced with 13th Army and more tanks and artillery, and the focus was placed on the Isthmus, where 600,000 soldiers prepared for a renewed attack. After 10 days of bombardment, and with better cooperation between armor and infantry, it commenced in early February, although massive frontal charges were still used. A breakthrough was soon achieved. The exhausted Finns were forced to retreat. They could not sustain heavy losses, although they continued to resist. Victory seemed near, but the Soviets were now ready to negotiate. Finland was eager to pick up talks, as they could not afford to continue the war, while the humiliated Soviets feared a Franco-British intervention. Germany also wanted peace to secure its vital iron ore source in Sweden, so Finland eventually accepted Soviet demands on the 29th of February and signaled its intention to negotiate, while Molotov dissolved their puppet government in Karelia. In early March, as the military situation further deteriorated, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on the 12th. A portion of Karelia, the Karelian Isthmus, and some land north of Lake Ladoga were given up, including Viipuri, the country's second largest city. This was 9% of the territory, but 12% of the population, most of who decided to leave. Petsamo and its mines were returned to Finland, but the Hanko Peninsula was leased to the Soviet Union as a military base for 30 years. After the war, Finland recognized 20,000 dead, while the Soviets lost around 50,000 dead and 160,000 sick or wounded, although estimates differ. The Soviet Supreme Command recognized initial failures and implemented several reforms. The role of political commissars was reduced, and old ranks were re-established in the Red Army, although some of these reforms were not fully carried out before the German invasion. International opinion supported the Finnish cause, thousands of volunteers arrived, and France and Britain contemplated an intervention, but this was not enough to prevent a Soviet victory, which was very costly and further encouraged Hitler to invade the Soviet Union. I will talk about Operation Barbarossa and other campaigns in my upcoming videos, so stay tuned. Thank you for watching, see you next time!